And I think that's a huge area in which things get all jacked up, is parts of us think we know what's okay and what's not okay. And then those parts act that out, but that probably isn't coming from self. It's coming from their own protective strategies, mechanisms, whatever.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Turning In podcast. Today, Amy and I spent time discussing self-led boundaries. I hope that you enjoy it. We're going to hop right into it today. If you are having a good listening experience, though, please make sure to give us a review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. And follow us on Instagram. Our handle is @TurningInPod. Really, really appreciate it. It goes a really long way. With all of that, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Turn. Today, it's Amy and I solo, like normal, really. We're going to talk about like normal. We're back. It's just you and I, no guests today. We are going to talk about boundaries, self-led boundaries. What are boundaries in general? I'm excited to get into that. I wanted really quickly to take a moment. We have a lot of new listeners recently, and I want everybody, we've had a ton of really, really amazing guests on, been sharing a lot of really cool conversation and time and space with people within this whole IFS realm. And with our new listeners, I want to invite you to go into our back catalog. If you're kind of newer to IFS, Amy and I started this whole project sort of breaking down the basic concepts of IFS and parts and polarizations and, all sorts of topics like that. So I want to invite any of our new or newer to IFS listeners to make sure that you go back and get kind of a debrief, I guess, on some of the basic concepts. You don't need that by any means to understand what we're going to talk about today, but I think it's a good reminder to learn, I guess, educate.
Well, yeah, I want to echo that because it gives really a rich foundation.
Yeah, foundation.
Of the fundamentals that I think help make sense of this model. It's really simple, and it just deepens the understanding so that one can maybe practice it and apply it a little bit more.
Absolutely. So yes, I'm going to take time to say that. And then I want to, let's just move right into boundaries. I feel like it's important, we'll get into sort of like the topic of self-led boundaries, parts, blah, 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 setting boundaries and things like that. But first of all, Amy, can we simply define, I guess, what a boundary is and then go into the general types of boundaries before we get into sort of even the IFS realm of things? Because I think this on its own within the human experience is an interesting topic. And we get a lot of, you, I'm sure in your practice, and then me and, in the facility I work in, it's a very relevant human topic.
Yes, definitely. Super relevant, because I think most of us have parts who inherently struggle with boundaries, whether it's setting them, keeping them, whatever. Honoring others' boundaries, that's another thing, definitely. Right? And that's all part driven. So we'll kind of pin that over there in IFS land as I take a moment to define, at least in my opinion, what boundaries are. So if we think just broadly around what a boundary is essentially a line, a marker in space that creates a differentiation from one side to another, if you will, whether it's a geographical or landmark type of a boundary, a state line. And if you apply that notion into emotional, physical, spiritual, sexual boundaries, whatever dimension of boundaries we want to kind of entertain, really a boundary is a line in the sand of saying what's okay and what's not okay. again, in my opinion, right? You might talk to other people who have varying definitions or beliefs or perspectives around it. And in my opinion, a boundary is clearly a line of demarcation of what's okay and what's not okay. I think a critical piece of that is stating what's okay and what's not okay. And I think that is what bungs up a bunch of our parts and being in relationship, is because we may in our head think we've established what's okay and what's not okay, but we haven't clearly articulated it to the person or people we're in relationship with so that they also have that same information.
Yeah, it's matter of establishing clarity for both sides, I think. And I may or may not talk more about this, or I guess I could talk about it right now, but when we get into IFS land. And I think in my opinion, the purpose of a boundary is to establish that clarity so we can protect the relationship. Like, it's not this me versus you thing. It's like, if we want to move forward in whatever capacity or not, I feel like on both sides, it's important that we have clarity in this boundary so that we can both remain safe in the relationship to whatever degree.
And that's what I was just going to say, is that boundaries, the critical piece of that, you just hit it, is that boundaries create safety. Without boundaries, there aren't safe parameters in which to exist in relationship, both with yourself, and with others. So that clarity that you spoke of is clutch in us both knowing what is okay and what is not okay for us first and foremost, so that then we can clearly articulate it to the person or people we're in relationship with, right? Because what happens is, I hear this all the time with my clients, is I don't even know what's okay and what's not okay. So the first step is really getting clear. So if we know that a boundary is stating clearly what's okay and what's not okay, we have to first and foremost get clear with what that means for us and our system before we can communicate it. And I think that's a huge area in which things get all jacked up, is parts of us think we know what's okay and what's not okay. And then those parts act that out, but that probably isn't coming from self. It's coming from their own protective strategies, mechanisms, whatever. And so the first thing that has to happen is getting space enough to really establish what really truly is okay for me to feel safe. Right? Because boundaries create safety. That's why they're so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the distinction there, and I think that's why we're both so on board with, this episode and this conversation and concept as a whole, because they're so relevant within relationship with one another. Like, I don't know a relationship in which I can't, I have to have boundaries in all of my relationships to some degree. And if I don't, then I'm just pouring, which is not effective, right? And that's not coming from self. And what you just said about, there's kind of a distinction that I can think of in my mind when I think of times that I've been really activated, or that those boundaries have been coming from parts, where it's almost like they're setting boundaries in order to keep that exile safe and that whole part of my system safe, not the self, you know what I mean? And setting boundaries from those different spaces creates a lack of clarity a lot of the time, because then when I switch and I'm in self, I'm like, oh wait, that's not relevant. That's not actually what I meant. And then I have to do this whole repair, and it's like a whole bunged up thing. So I don't know. I relate a lot to what you just said, and think it's really relevant.
Well, because what you're saying, that balancing act, we always talk about that triangle of managers, firefighters, protecting, and exile. That's the same thing that happens in boundaries, right? So it's like we have boundary keepers or boundary violators, boundary mess uppers, whatever, on both sides, firefighter and managers, all in an attempt to keep that exile that they're protecting safe. However, a lot of times just that small little triangle within our system isn't systemically and holistically what the rest of the system needs or wants. Right? It's like it's working in that microcosm. Yeah. However, it isn't in fact relevant for other parts of us and or self.
Yeah, it's showing up perfectly to try and protect that little, aspect without being able to take into consideration the entire system. And so, yeah, I really love this conversation, and I'm curious. So you named different sort of realms of boundaries, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, time boundaries. So there's a lot of different sort of like, I guess, boundary topics, one could say. As we're talking about IFS, firefighters, managers, and this may or may not totally equate, but there's also like different sort of like styles of boundaries that we can hold. So will you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so it equates perfectly and flawlessly to IFS, and so I'll definitely weave that in here. By history, most of us have different types of boundary styles that we pull from to create what we think is okay and what's not okay. One of which is what I'm going to label as rigid. Right? Parts of us that have rigid boundaries. If any of you have worked with me or gone to the retreats that Meghan and I run, you may bring into your mind this really poorly drawn image of a stick figure that's standing, or it looks more like it's lying dead, but standing in a box, a very rigid, thickly lined rectangle around said stick figure. And that symbolizes this idea of parts of us that have rigid boundaries, right? A boundary can also be defined almost as a membrane, a porous membrane that allows things in and allows things out. It is there for safety, as I mentioned, and it's kind of a coming in and a coming out. Boundaries are two ways, right? So now when parts of us have really rigid boundaries, what that means is that those parts are not letting anything out and they're not letting anything in. Again, all as a means of creating safety, but doing so at the deficit of connection, authenticity, open-heartedness, curiosity, compassion, really. Rigid boundaries, when part-driven, stop us from showing up in the world in a way that is connective, compassionate, and curious. Right. So as trauma survivors, it's not uncommon for parts of us to establish really, really rigid black and white boundaries. This is okay. This is not okay. Never, ever, ever. Makes sense. Right. Because that is what our parts believe will keep us safe from whatever happening again. If I create this rigid boundary, this will never happen again. That's not true. It still could happen again. Right. So having parts of us that are very rigid in our boundaries can be a deficit to us living wholeheartedly, right? Now, what often happens is that those are parts that are creating that rigidity. Now, there is a time and a place for self to come in and deliberately create a rigid boundary, say in one relationship, if that relationship has in fact proven to be unsafe, right? That is very different than having a one-size-fits-all rigid boundary style that our parts adopt, because then it is deliberately driven by self going, okay, you know what? For the safety of the system at whole in this particular dynamic or relationship or dimension of boundaries, financial, physical, spiritual, all the ones that we mentioned, I am choosing intentionally to be rigid and to say no firmly, because no is a complete sentence on its own sometimes. Well, it always is. And sometimes we need to be intentional and deliberate in saying it from self versus parts?
I think that is, and we'll get into that more, but I think that, like, in itself, what you just said, in like, is massive in distinguishing, because I have tons of personal experience where it's like I have these life rules and I have these life boundaries that are incredibly black and white and impossible to uphold if I want to have dynamic, healthy back and forth in the world, in my relationships. Whereas what you just said, not to totally exactly repeat what you just said, but it's like, whereas when I'm actually considering the individual nature of people in my life and relationships and what's going on and what's moving and ebbing and flowing for where I am and where they are, like, that's a totally different energy and totally different way to interact with, and kind of way to honor other people and myself when I'm able to not be wishy-washy, because like you said, there are things that are really objectively right and wrong to be able to, set boundaries with, and ways that we want to be treated and quote unquote stand up for ourselves, However, when that becomes this overarching, like you said, the
paradigm in which parts of us function in all dimensions of all boundaries,
everything,
then that's not cool for anyone. It's not effective for us. It's not healthy in relationship. And there is a time and place, right? Total time and place, when intentional, when deliberate, and when self-led, right?
Well, and I think that a lot of times when we're just starting to get used to setting boundaries, whether it's after trauma or not. And I mean, our definition of trauma, it's like after life, right?
Yeah.
We tend to be on this side of things, where I used to be like, I'm the boundary queen. And it's like, really, I was just fully imprisoning myself.
Right. Yeah. Boundaries are on a continuum also, right? As most things are, where it's a moving scale pending the person, the situation, the circumstance, the decision, the values being bumped up on. And it's true, Megan, what you said, that as we get into the next style that I'm going to talk about, that it's not uncommon for us as we start trying to practice boundaries, that parts of us may go from this next style, which is completely open and non-existent, to hardcore rigid imprisonment, like you said, where it's like, well, guess what? I went from here and saying yes all the time. I'm going to say no, and I'm going to be sharp with my edges, and I'm going to, so parts of us then totally pendulate to the other extreme of being rigid, and or the opposite for some, where we start super rigid and then we're like, oh my gosh, they need to soften. And the softening looks like having non-existent, completely missing boundaries. So this next style that I just alluded to is completely open boundaries, also known as non-existent. Non-existent may sound a little overgeneralized, but I'm going to use that deliberately right now to kind of drive the point home. So if we think of our little stick figure hanging out in a rectangle that has no openings whatsoever, and it's probably very thickly drawn and Sharpie. Now think of the same said stick figure existing with no structure around them whatsoever. Completely blank, empty, just little sweet stick figure hanging with nothing around them. So that would help us kind of visualize and symbolize this idea of having no boundaries, non-existent boundaries, completely porous, open boundaries. Now, some people might go, well, that sounds great, because then you mentioned that in and out factor, that things come in, things come out. Yes, everything comes in and everything goes out. So not healthy, not effective. For parts of us who have codependency things, the codependent parts that a lot of us carry, that can often look like this boundary style, where parts of us say yes all the time for fear of what we might be deemed as or perceived if we do say no, or if we do have boundaries. This is for the parts of us that bleed out, who, just really don't know what's okay and what's not okay.
People pleasing, workaholism, like those parts of us that, want to. I mean, and it can come from either protective category, you know what I mean? Where it's like people that want to numb and avoid through this, or this, with lack of boundaries of, structure in my life. And then also, the people pleasing and the don't want to be perceived as, whatever, saying no or what, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, there's some threat in having boundaries to our parts. And when that threat feels so strong, parts of us just abandon having them altogether. At times, of course, right? Again, I'm being a little extreme in my languaging. And so when parts of us are afraid of what the fallout could be in having or setting a boundary, then we have parts that have a tendency to look like they have none at all, right? Which often, all of this, remember that balancing act goes back to the exile energy of, if I have a boundary, then I won't be loved, then I'll be abandoned. Or if I have a boundary, some of the messaging might sound like, if I have a boundary, or I don't even deserve to have a boundary. Who am I to think I deserve to have a boundary? Right. And so there's just this complete openness.
And this kind of goes back to the rigid boundaries, and just to state kind of like the exiles thought process, it makes me think of like kind of how our exiles want to redeem the experience a lot of the time, where it's like the never again. So I know that you already stated that, but it's like, just to kind of like drive home how a lot of the times our parts are the ones driving these sort of like more unhealthy styles of unhealthy, quote unquote. They're doing their job, but it's
a guarantee that our parts are the ones that have been driving our boundaries for decades, unless we have truly done this work. I mean, I probably haven't been quite as direct in saying that. And I am saying it with all the confidence of self, that for the majority of us, it is parts of us who are driving our boundaries. And that is not always a bad thing.
Right.
And it can impact our ability to be in relationship in safe, healthy, effective ways if it is solely part driven without little awareness. Right.
Okay. Sorry, I kind of interrupted the.
Well, yeah, no. And so, it's so rigid and open are essentially polarizations. Parts polarized in different styles of boundary making. And, if you think of it, a lot of times the individual who has parts that lack boundaries, what ends up happening is then they end up having other parts that get resentful and get pissed off and get angry because they start feeling taken advantage of, this, that, or the other. And then that is also where pendulation can happen, where then other parts come in, such as firefighters, and are like, screw this, I'm done, cut and run, out. Right? So if you think of this dynamic, how does having open boundaries impact parts that then swing to the other side of like the cut and run sort of vibe, right? Or vice versa. Right? So it's all this hugely rich, complicated, and complex dynamic that is happening internally amongst all of these. Now, the next boundary style that I think is worth mentioning is and I think Meghan may have already mentioned the phrase like mixed messaging, if you will. So a mixed boundary style that is inconsistent. And that's kind of how I might want to label this one, as inconsistent boundaries. So if we're sticking with my really, really brilliant imaging, and for all of you, when this one goes live, what I'll do actually on my Instagram that, I have a whopping 100 followers on because I'm so active on it. And I'm okay with that, by the way. That wasn't like some passive aggressive plug. Is I will post my really rich diagram of my stick figure drawing. So how this one would look is stick figure in the middle with no dimension that has a dashed line followed by a bunch of space with maybe a little bit of a shorter dashed line, maybe a little space, Next time, a lot of space with the dashed line. So really inconsistent spacing around said stick figure. We need a name for the stick figure. Anyhow, and so the really inconsistency in boundaries where individuals outside of us in relationship and then the parts of us inside don't know what the hell we're getting. It's a mixed message. A lot of you have seen me do this hand signal where it's like I have my one hand palm facing out, kind of like stop, and then I have my other hand palm facing me, like come on, come on, come on. It's that mixed messaging of like stop, no, it's okay, stop, no, it's okay. Those are probably the most challenging to both be in relationship with externally as well as internally for our parts. And that's what causes our parts to think they can't trust who we are because it doesn't feel safe. They don't know even what they're going to get. When in fact, what's happening is parts of us are all over the place, pushing and pulling, saying yes when we mean no, saying no when we mean yes, and creating really, I keep using the word inconsistent, but inconsistency equals lack of safety. When things are inconsistent, we don't feel safe. And so that's going to be the same. Yeah.
I have like an example. I feel like everybody can probably relate to this without the example. And it's like, if you think about being at an employer, like in a relationship with an employer where your performance is always graded on something new and random, it's like the bar is always moving and always changing. How are you ever, one performance review, it's rated on showing up on time, and then the next performance review it's rated on quota or whatever, and it's like you're never given like a consistent level playing field to know like how to be quote unquote good at your job, how to perform well. That's the easiest sort of societal example I can come up with. That it creates such a it's like this instability of like, well, wait, the target's always moving. How am I? And that happens externally. I've been in external relationships, and I've also had relationship with myself where you're saying like exactly what you're saying. It's really challenging for my internal system in my past to know, because one week I'd say this and the next week I'm doing this. And it's like, wait, team, where are we at?
Yeah, it's unpredictable, and no one likes unpredictability. And when the target is moving or the messages are changing, no one can keep up to speed, and that inherently creates a lack of safety. Right. And so that, I would say that happens especially more on like a faster pace level, I think, before our system has tried to swing to one side of rigid or one side of open. And that can happen on a more micro level of that, okay, I've said yes to, helping make, 500 brownies for my daughter's softball team. I said yes once. That's not true. That didn't happen. That's not actually true. Yeah, I know. I'm being super exaggerative, right? But like the parts of us that have no boundaries where we're like, yes, of course I'll do that. Sure. No problem. And you say that a few times, and then someone comes to you and you're like, hey, we got this, Brene Brown uses this example often. Hey, we've got this fundraiser happening. Can you make, 250 Rice Krispie treats? And then all of a sudden we're pissed. Parts are like, and then they lash out. So for the person that we've said yes to a gazillion times, or parts of us have said yes to, because not once have we actually slowed our damn roll and been like, hold on, let me think and let me check in with everyone inside of me to see if that feels okay. For self to give an answer. Our parts are like, yeah, I'll do it. And then next time we're asked, we're like, F you, screw you, no. And then the person's like, whoa, who are you? Right? So again, it's just that inconsistent, unpredictable messaging that isn't safe in relationship, internally or externally. Right?
Yeah, it's really confusing.
And, which then I think leads us to this sort of optimal place of boundaries, which is self-led boundaries, right? Where they are consistent, they're predictable. Our parts can inform self and how that looks and what their concerns may be. And ultimately, self is making a clear, confident decision based on what is in the best benefit of our system in whole.
Well, and I think when as we're moving into the self-led boundaries, there is that distinction, because earlier we were talking about how boundaries will by nature evolve to some degree, even from self, as we move about our lives, as we move about individual relationships. That is very different than this inconsistent boundary that we were just talking about.
Yes.
And I want to kind of different. Like talk just for 2 seconds about that, because it's not like as we're moving into self-led boundaries, that they're,
once you set it stays. No, absolutely not.
Like we are allowed to
change. Yep. You know, I have a client, and I don't know if he'll be listening to this, but our big joke is this saying I handed down to him, which is, as an autonomous adult, you are allowed to have boundaries, and those boundaries are allowed to change and shift based on what feels safe to your system as a whole.
And that is different than what feels best to that part of my system that holds those inconsistent bounds. That's like the thing that super different energy.
Anyway, very different. No, I mean, that's it. Real boundaries can shift and change pending choice and consent of safety of the system as a whole. And that comes from self, not our parts. Our parts can inform that, of course. And believe me, sometimes I call upon my parts to help me set boundaries, right? Like there are times I have to have parts of me who are voraciously strong and almost overcompensatorily confident to help me sometimes, if you will, to get into self, to be able to have that hard talk. And still self is the one doing it, even if those parts are flanking and on my sides. Right? So there's room for parts to be involved in setting boundaries, and ultimately self is who we want the boundaries to be coming from. And that gets to change if self decides so, because consent or choice is shifting, right?
Well, and I think I'm just sort of having this full realization, in the beginning of the episode. We have a lot of new listeners, and so I really do want to make sure, like, of course, this episode on its own can be listened to and understood without it. And I think there is a part of me that like really wanted and wants people to have that foundational understanding of parts as you're listening to this boundary setting, because
for sure,
the different ways in which we're communicating boundaries and the different systems that they're coming from and their different intentions as we're setting them, there's such a different way that we communicate them and come up with them. I mean, like, generally from part to self, and the way that they're received.
Very much so.
We talk all about self begets self, and it's like when I'm setting boundaries from a self-led place, they're received so much differently, at least initially, than when I'm coming and barking them, which I have tons of experience barking my boundaries about the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And, if you think even of the different categories of parts, just protective parts, managers and firefighters, as you just suggested, each of those categories alone will kind of show how we communicate our boundaries. Firefighters are going to be much more aggressive, angry, resentful, quick to like cut and run, like I said, or blow shit up. Right. And blowing stuff up is a way, in fact, parts of us do set boundaries. Right. Absolutely. I've done it myself many a time. And so, firefighters are going to have very extreme, impulsive, reactionary ways in which they set boundaries. Managers, and again, I'm being slightly generalized, managers are going to set boundaries with, as you already suggested, Megan, pleasing, perfecting, performing, lying is another way in which we set boundaries. And that can come from both firefighters or managers, pending what's going on. So yeah, getting even really clear of how is the boundary being set, who's setting it, what's the agenda or intention in setting it, what are the edges that the boundary is being set in, like are they sharp, are they soft, are they more compassionate, are they pleasing, because pleasing is different than compassionate. Setting nice boundaries is different than setting compassionate boundaries. So yeah, I just think I think this is a fun place for us to just kind of sit, zoom out, and go, interesting. Yeah, next time I go to set a boundary, that I'm stating what is okay and what's not okay, who's doing it inside of me, what's the energy behind it, and does it have systemic consent that this does feel like it's coming from self, a place of compassion, compassion, curiosity, clarity, and am I being clear to me, and am I being clear to you?
Well, and realizing whether you're having these conversations or not, life is about boundaries. Like, you are always communicating your boundaries, whether you're communicating them or not. So, which makes it all the more important to actually set a real intentional boundary, because that's kind of what we're doing with every move we make, not to, put so much pressure on every move we make.
But you asking me, hey, can we do an episode this weekend? That's a boundary. You're essentially, I'm assuming, saying what's okay with you, which is to record this weekend. And then what I need to do, if I care about relationship with you, Megan, is for me to go, okay, let me check in. Let me do my U-turn. Let me see. Because parts of me are like, I don't want to wake up early, and I'm up early. I don't want to have something to do early. So they might have a feeling. I have other parts that are like, yeah, that's fun. It's like, okay, slow down. Let me just check really what is okay and what's not okay. Right? That's a boundary. So as you suggested, we are setting boundaries. We are interfacing with boundaries and having opportunities to create boundaries, set boundaries, honor boundaries, violate boundaries all day long, every day. These aren't just the big things, right? Like,
which makes it all the more important to show up in and for our system in as much of a self-led way as possible. And that's not to say that, you said it explicitly, that up to this point in our lives and continuing throughout our lives, we will set boundaries through parts. The goal isn't to be in self all the time. And so, we're inherently going to set a boundary either explicitly or just by nature of moving about the world through parts. And that's fine. We need our parts.
And when we mess up after a boundary, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, this is exactly where I was going. So I'm glad.
So it's like when we mess up, usually we know because our parts start showing up and acting up and backlashing, and they have a lot to say to us. So that's really a critical place for us to pause and pay attention to, oh, this didn't feel right. I got that sinking pit in my stomach. Or I'm angry. A part of me is angry. That's the perfect opportunity for us to slow down. Again, I know hopefully it's predictable to the listeners. Slow down, take your foot off the pedal, pause, do the U-turn, and see what's going on. And then that helps us both learn next time. And it's never too late to also circle back at that point based on the information to then go and repair, correct, add or edit whatever parts of you just spoke that violated maybe your own system's boundaries based on what self would have had you do and or the other person's boundaries.
That is exactly where I was going to go, because at the end of the day, as long as we're not doing so in like an abusive way, right? We're not trying to like love bomb and gaslight people, but
and or perpetrate abusively or do anything.
And when we're talking about what my experience as of, recently in my life, recently as in the last 15 years, before I was when I was using drugs and stuff, it was a little different, right? But as I've grown into that,
recently, I was expecting 2 weeks. I was like, oh, no. We're talking 15 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, recently, not that it's always been like this, and there's history of trauma and things there. It's that repair in relationship, that sort of messing up and coming from this place or that place and then being able to circle back, that is where that connection a lot of the time lies, of saying and coming to people and being able to say, this is where I was coming from, and I didn't communicate this effectively, and I didn't do this well, and it wasn't a great representation of how I truly feel. That's where that real juice in relationships a lot of the times is to be able to, just going back to the point of we need our parts,
right.
And we need to be able to get into self to circle back and actually have that dynamic conversation.
So when parts of us screw up boundaries, what a beautiful, rich opportunity for a corrective experience, both for us internally with our parts and then externally with whomever maybe we ruptured with and had an ouch with. Let's use a hyperbolic example of making 500 brownies for a softball team. Me saying yes to something like that isn't actually hyperbolic. Probably the number 500 is. No.
Yes.
So I say yes, I say yes, I say yes. Parts of me say yes, they say yes, they say yes, they say yes. And then a part of me lashes out in an angry way and says, no. Right? What a great opportunity for me to zoom out after I did this and acted out, and my parts acted out in that way. For me to check in, pause, do the U-turn, see what's up for me, get clear on that, so that then I can get clear with the person I owe a repair with to say, hey, right? We speak for our parts. Hey, a part of me lashed out because it was feeling really resentful because I recognize I say yes a lot when I mean no. That's not on you, and I'm so sorry. What was that like for you when I acted in that way? Right? Checking out the impact on them, seeing what they need from that. What a beautiful way to correct. And then what a beautiful way to say, you know what? Right now, I can't make any promises. I know I said yes, and I feel guilty letting you down. I can't actually do that. Or what I can do is I can make 100 or whatever, right? You're allowed to, right. So there are ways to correct both internally and externally after a boundary violation has gone down.
And they always will, because here's the thing, people, is that I can go about my life setting any different type of boundary. And although, sure, there's certainly perpetrators in the world, people will go about their lives and they will cross my boundaries. And it's generally not intentional.
And my parts will let them cross my boundaries too.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
Not only will they have parts that violate my boundaries, sometimes my parts allow people to violate my boundaries. Right? Happens. And as we were just mentioning, since boundaries are a thing that occur all day long in many different facets, many different dimensions, on small levels and on big levels, what great opportunity to practice and to get clear and to repair and to screw up and to try again.
And to allow ourselves to be human. I say it, I feel like every episode is just the breadth of the human experience. This is just such a beautiful way to be able to have perspective of that we're complex, multiplicitous human beings. I do want to ask, and this might be slightly convoluted, so I'm not exactly sure where we'll go with this, because we're talking a lot about our expression of boundaries, but what about our receptivity towards other people's boundaries, and doing that in a self-led way? Because I also have, so being the previous boundary queen who barked her boundaries all around the planet, I also have the experience of getting kind of defensive when other people set boundaries with me, and or getting kind of mousy and feeling like, oh, I've got, and that also comes from parts. And so I feel like as we're talking about setting boundaries in a self-led way, it's also kind of important to talk about receiving boundaries in a self-led way.
Well, yeah, because it is a two-way street. And I don't know that I have anything more to say than what you did, which is really, it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
We have to also be willing to receive boundaries, others' boundaries, right? And honor them, even if they don't make sense to parts of us. And I think you hit it kind of in the most masterful way of like categorically, if I think I were to broad stroke how parts of us show up when receiving, I think either very fawning, pleasing, mousy, as you used, or defensively, right? So again, managerial, firefighters, right? Who's hearing the person setting the boundary? Which part of me is hearing the person setting it? And it's okay for us to slow that down too, to say, hey, listen, I hear what you're saying. Can I just take a moment because I've got some stuff showing up for me and I want to be able to hear this as effectively as possible for you. But right now I can't. I have a part that wants to please and say yes, even though I don't know if that's true for me. Right? So it's the same. Let me guess. It's the same thing. Take your foot off the pedal, take the pause and do the U-turn and get clear on what's showing up for you so that you can ask those parts to give a little bit of space to hear from the ears of self whatever is being asked of you from another person, right? Of what's okay for them, what's okay or what's not okay for them, and what helps their system feel safe. Right.
And so hopefully we're in relationship with people where you can ask those questions and you can say those things. You can say, okay, I'm hearing you. Can I ask a clarifying question about this? And being able to say, I want to make sure that I am fully in self and understanding what you're meaning because I love and care about you. So can we slow down? And that's not always gonna be the case. And that's my hope, is that we're in relationship with people where we can have that dialogue. As cheesy as it might sound, I've been in so many conversations where I can literally say exactly that, where it's like, let me slow down for a minute. Can we take a 3-minute break? And those are always the most, the relationships in my life that carry the most depth.
Definitely. And, I had a part that was like, well, if you can't do that in relationship, even if it takes a week to come back to, then check the relationship. I had a part that got all sassy on her pedestal, like, then it's not a healthy relationship. And there may be some truth to that part that just got hot and heavy over that philosophy. And at the end of the day, relationships need to be safe. Even if parts are defensive and angry in relationship, there has to be able to be a softening and a spaciousness between the two parties to be able to get back to that place, even if it takes a hot second, right? But yeah, I mean, obviously, since it's a parts party for most of us a lot of the time, and we're blended with our parts, we have to expect the same of others. So if you're right, so they're gonna have their parts up also. And often it becomes parts interfacing with parts. And that's just another opportunity to slow it down, just to slow it all down and get clear. Who's talking on my behalf? Who's talking on your behalf? And what can we do to maybe hear each other a little bit more from self?
And you're so right. Like, we are interfacing generally with other people's parts and things coming up for them. And I think that's what creates such a responsibility for us, obviously, to slow down, because I have no control over who I'm interfacing with you with. And we go back, and I feel like it's been in the recent episodes where I just like constantly saying self begets self, self begets self. But it's true, right? Is like, as I can slow down and be in self in whatever conversation possible, even just with, a glimmer or some, it allows you then to calm down, or, we just released this episode is, as we're talking about this, I think our last episode was with Sue Richmond, and she talks, in that conversation about as I'm able to slow down, or if I'm meeting someone, as we were talking about calling on self-like parts, is like I have to call on my parts sometimes to set these boundaries. I have to call on my self-like parts or whatever parts to be able to stand up for myself. And as that's met with, self-like energy, then my system's able to relax, or vice versa. And I don't know. It's just also human.
Well, human and revolutionary. I mean, if we all just slowed it down a bit and got clear as to what is showing up for us and who is actually engaging with the people we're in relationship with, be pretty miraculous, the changes that would happen just simply doing that. Right?
Yeah. I mean, you can see it from day to day, and you can see it from day to day, or I can see it from day to day in my own life. Think about that on like a global scale. It's like,
yeah.
And you could, I mean, again, I can always be expected to say, well, I could go meta on this topic.
Yeah.
You could argue that already is happening. And yeah, we don't have to go down that path. Okay, so that is there anything else? Is there anything else like that you think we've missed? I feel like personally that's a pretty good intro to boundaries, intro to the types of boundaries. So we've got, all of the different realms of boundaries. We've got the different types of boundaries. We've got the different protector parts that are frequently setting the boundaries in order to protect us, and the importance of having those dynamic, self-led, securely attached and consistent communication of boundaries. Anything else that's coming up?
I think for today, no. I think this is something that can, go other directions and deepen even more. And for today, that feels complete to me.
Totally. I agree with that. I want to see, so we have our Spotify playlist. Obviously, we talk about it every episode. I have not personally added any songs or new jams to that recently. We've been adding our guests, and I listen to it a lot because I think it's a freaking great playlist. Is there anything?
It is a great playlist
that your system's been jamming to recently or really enjoying and that we should add? Because I've got one. Actually, I'm hoping it's not already on there.
What is it?
Okay, so the song that I've really been loving recently is, and I have to actually look it up to make sure because it's from a country artist, and I'm not a huge...
What?
Oh yeah, I'm not a huge... So there's two, I guess. There's a song called Straight and Narrow by Sam Barber. And then this is the one that I think might already be on there, but it's called Sun to Me by Zach Bryan. There's a Luke Bryan and a Zach Bryan, so I wanted to make sure that I gave it.
I think you have another Zach Bryan song
I do,
there,
Heading South.
But no, that one's not. Okay. The one you just mentioned, I don't believe is on there. No.
So I'm going to add those two. And then I've got a few others, but I'm not going to. Those are the two recently that my system's been really enjoying. What about you?
I'm Trevor Hall all day long, all day, every day. But the one of his newer songs that was dropped in early April, All of My Lessons, is the one that I can't stop listening to.
Did he play that in Red Rocks?
He sure did.
I'm like, those are some of my favorites when you can take yourself back to that time. Ooh,
yeah. Love that. Yeah. So that's that's my looped song as of late.
Well, we're gonna add them. We're gonna add them to the podcast, or excuse me, awesome. The playlist.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you, Amy, as always. So, I hope everybody's been enjoying all of the interviews and kind of conversations that we've been having. Amy and I are always gonna make sure that we come back on and have some of these sort of foundational conversational episodes just between the two of us. As we
can I give a quick shout out real fast?
No.
I just want to, good. So is it okay if I violate your boundary right now? I heard you say no, but I think it was a part of you who was being a smartass. I'm not sure. So I just want to thank Gwyneth Paltrow. She has been loving up on us.
My God. Yeah.
Like Gwyneth Paltrow has been loving up on us. So I just want to give a quick shout out. So thank you, Gwyneth, for listening to us and telling others to. It means the world.
Yeah, that's been actually such an honor because the platform that she has, she does not have to use for a small little podcast.
No, and she does.
The Turning In podcast. She has twice with no warning, with no asking. Like it's been really kind of parts of me have been like amazed by that. So yes, I think that was fully in due time, Amy, that shout out. So
me violating your boundary when you said no, that was okay. Do we need to repair?
You know what? I don't think so. No, we're good. Okay, well, thank you everybody for tuning in to the Turning In podcast. Please make sure to leave us a review on Spotify, Apple, anywhere that you listen, and follow us on Instagram. Our handle is @TurningInPod, and keep tuning in for awesome IFS conversations. Thanks, everybody.